Dr. Sherzai, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Leanna. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I have to say, Dean wanted to join, but he has completely lost his voice over the weekend. I think it was a bug or something. He feels fine, but he apologizes in the background, sipping green tea and sending his love to everyone.
And watching the live stream, so just as well.
Of course.
So Dr. Sherzai, let's just open up with a simple question, which is what inspires you and your husband to work as hard as you do?
A purpose-driven life. You know, when you have a beautiful purpose and you're having fun working with your partner, with your loved one, it's not work anymore. That's just a beautiful life. So, and I'm really privileged to be in a field that is continuously growing, and we're continuously learning more and more. And it's the brain. What can I say? You know, I saw my friend Columbus Batiste just speaking a few minutes ago, and we joke around with our cardiologist friends and we say, you know, the brain is the most important organ in the body. You know that, right? The heart comes second. But no, I'm kidding. I'm joking. But, you know, the brain is just a fascinating organ, and it's so wonderful to be in this area to learn more about it.
And one of the things you've been working on for years and years is the Alzheimer's research. So genetics or lifestyle? That's the question. What is it? Is it certain? Where's the research going in that area?
It's wonderful that you're asking, because I just did a post yesterday on our social media talking about the impact of ApoE4, which is a very important gene that is associated with Alzheimer's disease. And, you know, currently, right, a few days ago, I think it was a few days ago, last week, you know, one of the Hollywood stars, Chris Hemsworth, was on the TV, and this particular show came, and he found out that he had two of the very important genes that puts him at a high risk for Alzheimer's disease. And he took some time off, and, you know, people have been talking more about it. And when you look at the bigger picture, it's both genes and lifestyle. But the genetics are such that we don't really have very strong Alzheimer's genes. We do, but the percentage of patients who have those kind of genes that are very, very strongly linked to the disease. So for example, if they have those genes, they will definitely get Alzheimer's disease. That constitutes only about 3 to 5% of all of the cases. For the rest of the 95%, there are genes that put us at high risk for Alzheimer's disease, but lifestyle controls them. So there are genes that manage, say, for example, cholesterol metabolism, or how our body metabolizes glucose, or how we fight against inflammation and oxidation. And if we do the right things in our life, those genes never get activated.
So why do women seem to be at more risk than men?
Women tend to have, well, from the data that we have so far, you know, the data that's coming to us for women who are over the age of 70, it seems that there are two factors. One, we know that menopause, the hormonal changes that women's bodies go through, and how vascular risk factor affects women are different. And especially during menopause and the premenopause stage, our bodies don't really have the resilience to deal with blood pressure, high cholesterol, insulin resistance, and diabetes, as well as men do. That's something that we're still trying to understand better. But one of the other hypotheses that we are facing right now is that the women that are living now with cognitive impairment or dementia, back when they were living, say, for example, in the 60s or in the 50s or earlier, they didn't really have the kind of exposure to cognitive resilience as much as men did. So for example, most women weren't really working out of homes. Most women didn't really have the kind of challenging and complex work environments that men did. And that seems to play a very, very strong role in building that cognitive resilience and reserve. And that's being studied as well. So basically there are two factors right now that scientists are looking into as far as women's risk is concerned.
So the shift for optimal brain health, you created the acronym NEURO, which is kind of appropriate, right? So can you explain to us what those initials stand for, and whether they all apply equally or some are more important than others?
Very self-serving, isn't it? Neuro, the acronym. So Neuro was this cute acronym that we put together because I think, you know, with the kind of lives that we have, it's important to kind of know what to do on a regular basis. And so we came up with Neuro. The letters stand for: N is for nutrition, E is for exercise, U is for unwind or stress management, R is for restorative sleep or getting deep sleep, which I'll elaborate on. And O is for optimizing cognitive activity, keeping our minds active. So when it comes to brain health, it's the multifaceted approach and the comprehensive aspect of lifestyle is what matters. Sure, a lot of people got the nutrition part right, but they probably don't really have the sleep or the cognitive activity part right. So it's important to get all of them right. And from what we know so far, from the research that is being done and from our own work, they're all very critical. And based on people's risk factors in their lives, one could be more important than the other, but all of them have to be taken care of at the same time. And just briefly to kind of run over them, as far as nutrition is concerned, from tremendous amount of data for many, many years, there's a lot of people who say nutrition is very confusing. It's not really confusing. We have a lot of data that tells us that when people eat an unprocessed, plant-based, it could be plant exclusive, a whole food plant-based diet, or even a plant predominant diet, they tend to do better. Whether it's the Mediterranean diet or the MIND diet, which stands for Mediterranean-Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. These are the two dietary patterns that have been studied extensively as far as their benefit for brain health is concerned. When you look at these dietary patterns, it's essentially a scoring system. It's a construct that was put together where people get a higher score when they consume whole grains, beans, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, and avoid sources of saturated fats from meat, cheese, dairy, and other animal products. And they get a low score when they eat meat, cheese, dairy, animal products, and sources of saturated fat. So any dietary construct essentially prioritizes plants, and it de-emphasizes saturated fats coming from animal products. And in one study from Rush University, when people adhered very well to the MIND diet, they reduced their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by 53%, which is incredible. But the good news is that it was not an all or none phenomenon. Even when people adhere to it, just moderately, they reduce their risk of Alzheimer's disease by 35%. So it's great news. And this is something that I personally and Dean were both very passionate about, which is, meeting people where they are. And I know that the theme of this conversation and this whole conference is that, small little incremental steps of change towards that optimal goal is very, very important. So that was critical.
So I know in the conversation about heart, they say greens are the healthiest. Is there a healthiest of the healthy? We know staying to a plant-based, plant-exclusive diet is optimally healthy, but what would you tell people to eat this every day?
Yeah, that is hard, but I would be very accurate if I told them to eat greens because we have evidence for that. There was one study that showed that when people consumed one serving of greens, whether it's cooked or raw, just one serving per day, they had brains that was 11 years younger. So it looked better and it actually functioned better too. So I don't believe in superfoods. I don't think there is such a thing as a superfood because we eat multiple foods together and it's the synergy between these foods that matter most. But greens are really good. And so are berries. And we actually have studies that show that when people consume berries, they actually tend to have lower risk of dementia. And it's the specific components like flavonols and these colored polyphenols that actually fight inflammation and oxidation and are just tremendously good.
Leanna, you need to turn your sound on, mic on.
Thank you, thank you. So, Dr. Sherzai, you did a pretty substantial study of diabetes and Alzheimer's. Can you tell us what you studied and what you found?
Yes, the study that we conducted, well, there were two studies. One of them was just to look at the relationship between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. And we found out that when people have diabetes, they have higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. But the more interesting study was to look at insulin resistance, which is steps away from diabetes. It essentially means that when people start having difficulty metabolizing glucose, which is a source of fuel for the body, because our insulin levels are not appropriate or the body doesn't recognize glucose as fuel, and so it starts damaging the body. Even at that stage, if people had insulin resistance, they had lower cognitive state, which means that they weren't able to memorize things better, or they weren't able to process information better. And so I know that everybody starts worrying about having diabetes, but even having insulin resistance or pre-diabetes before they get diabetes can affect our thinking process. And it makes sense from a biochemical perspective. The main fuel for brain cells, I know that everybody talks about ketogenic diet, and there's a lot of misinformation about that. The main fuel is glucose. And when we're not able to metabolize that properly, the brain doesn't function very well.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. And you also recently did a really big review of the research on omega-3 fatty acids and their impact on the developing brain and the aging brain. Can you tell our viewers what you found and how these findings impact what we eat?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, it was recently published, and we wanted to see what was the impact of omega-3 fatty acid supplementation on the brain. And we found out that it kind of affected the two bookends of life in children and in elderly, especially those who had the beginnings of very mild cognitive impairment. And it seems that during these two phases, the brain needs omega-3 fatty acids very much. Omega-3 fatty acids are the only type of fatty acids that our brain essentially needs on a regular basis, not saturated fats, not cholesterol, omega-3 fatty acids. And it is very important for maintaining the architecture and the infrastructure of the brain, as well as in the transmission of information between cell to cell and proper electrical communication between different parts of the cell. Now, it's not for everyone. So if people are getting it from food, not during these two stages of life, that's great. So we can get omega-3 fatty acids from, say, chia seeds, flax seeds, from hemp, from walnuts, and things of that nature. It's great, but it's important for people to realize that they need to assess their need for omega-3 fatty acids during these two stages of their lives.
And how do you recommend that people do that?
Yeah, so we think that it's important for people to talk to either a pediatrician for children or to a physician for adult patients to find out if they don't have any contraindications for taking DHA supplementation. We believe that they can get it from an algae-based omega-3 fatty acid or DHA supplement from algae. There have been studies that show that algae DHA is the same as fish DHA. We are worried about some of the contaminants in the ocean, and fish being animals and bioconcentrators. There is always a danger of having mercury or lead or so many other chemicals that unfortunately we throw in our oceans. But an algae-based DHA is actually safer. The fish actually derive their DHA from algae to begin with. So what we're doing is basically just getting rid of that middleman and going to the source and getting DHA. And that could potentially be useful for children and adults.
Great. And a lot of people in the field of health and nutrition talk about the importance of healthy fats generally for brain health. But can you talk about the difference between the importance of omega-3s versus other kinds of fats and maybe dispel some of the myths that are circulating out there?
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, we know that the brain is made out of fat. Sometimes the numbers are exaggerated. People say 70 to 80%, but it's around 50% of our brain is actually made out of fat. The rest is actually water. It is important for us to consume fats, but the type of fat that we need on a daily basis are omega-3 fatty acids, DHA specifically. DHA constitutes most of the infrastructure of the brain. About 60% of the brain is essentially made out of DHA. And we don't have storage systems of DHA in the brain. So it's important for us to consume it on a regular basis because our bodies don't make it. The other types of fats, we actually don't need it. The brain has the capacity and the system to actually create cholesterol, enough cholesterol to help with the maintenance process or making sure that all of the different production of hormones and neurochemicals take place on a regular basis. So we don't really need dietary cholesterol for that. And definitely not saturated fats. Saturated fats coming from, say, for example, dairy products or animal products, they don't even pass the blood-brain barrier. So our brain is hermetically sealed in a very, very tight environment. The blood-brain barrier are the junctions between these very small little arteries that only allow certain things to pass through. And there are actually small little gates and receptors that allow, say, for example, glucose or some other molecules to pass through. It's very, very difficult for anything to pass through it. Saturated fat is actually a large molecule. So when people think that they need to eat a lot of fat from dairy and meat, what happens is, first of all, it doesn't pass through. Second, it starts damaging the arteries, especially the inner lining of the arteries called the endothelium. And that inflammation can cause damage to the arteries, lack of blood flow to the brain, lack of nutrition flow to the brain. And over time, even if there's not a clot formation when people have a stroke, there's slow and gradual damage to these small little blood vessels. And us neurologists, when people come in with, say, for example, mild cognitive impairment, when we do neuroimaging, when we get CT scans or MRIs of their brain, we see these fluffy white matter changes. It's called white matter disease. And these white matter disease or fluffy changes are essentially damage to those very, very sensitive blood vessels that have been damaged over time because of glucose intolerance, because of too much saturated fat in their diet. And that can end up becoming vascular cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease later on as well. And multiple studies have shown that when people consume too much saturated fats, their risk of having Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementias is very, very high. So making sure that we get DHA, whether it's from algae, chia seeds, flax seeds, nuts, hams, whatever, and reducing sources of saturated fats is critically important.
Thank you. You explained that so clearly, and it's just interesting to think about the visuals of how the brain interacts with all the things floating in the bloodstream and the things that can't get through. Super fascinating. Since you mentioned mild cognitive impairment, I'm actually wondering, for those who are living with some form of cognitive impairment, let alone Alzheimer's or dementia, is it ever too late to make changes to diet and lifestyle? Is it possible for people to improve brain health or quality of life at those stages of disease?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So to the best of our knowledge today, I think it's important for us to understand the different stages of cognitive impairment. So, we all live a very busy life, and some of us actually start having some memory problems, and we become very forgetful, and we don't really process information as fast as we used to when we were younger. And it could be potentially because of lack of sleep and too many factors in our lives. But at some point, we actually all experience some cognitive decline. And those are the group of people that never really get diagnosed properly. It just kind of is brushed off as like, oh, you're tired and things of that nature. But then when it affects our memory to a point where people get, they notice it, or when people start having difficulty with, say, for example, their jobs, and it's just a consistent pattern, that usually is defined as mild cognitive impairment, MCI. And from the studies, we know that if we are at this vague cognitive impairment and even in the mild cognitive impairment stage, lifestyle can definitely, reverse some of the damage. And there have been studies that show that when people invest in their health and they start eating better and they exercise and they address their vascular risk factors like blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, and things of that nature, they can reverse the damage done during this particular stage. And that's what Dean and I are very, very focused on in the communities, to tell people that it's incredibly important to identify it early and do something about it, because this is where things can be done. But beyond that, beyond mild cognitive impairment, if it becomes Alzheimer's disease, say, for example, and it's the mild, moderate, and advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease, lifestyle can slow down the progression of the disease, but it's almost impossible to reverse the damage at that side. And I'm saying this because I'm very concerned about my patients, and I see patients on a regular basis, and there are a lot of doctors that keep on saying that Alzheimer's disease can be reversed, and that is not true at all. Unfortunately, by that time, when people start having difficulty with their jobs and their activities of daily living, it's very impossible to reverse it. But there's so much we can do with the mild cognitive impairment stage.
For people who have Alzheimer's in their family, but haven't shown any cognitive decline, what are the first steps they should be taking right now? Is it diet? Is it lifestyle? Is it everything you've been talking about? Anything in particular?
Yeah, you're basically saying my story. So I have two grandparents from both mother and father side, and now recently another grandparent who is experiencing cognitive impairment as well. So I know that I have a very, very strong family history of Alzheimer's disease, and so does Dean. And so I'm assuming that I do have the genes, and I am trying my best to live a very, very healthy life. The concept, is it too late? That doesn't really exist, because we have such a resilient brain. I mean, as sensitive as the brain is, it is quite resilient as well. And if we give it an opportunity, it continues to grow, it continues to heal itself. Just an example. So we have 87 billion neurons or brain cells. Each of these cells can make as little as 2 connections between each other. And these connections are how fast you can process information and how fast you can memorize things, or as many as 30,000 connections each. And these connections are made and broken whether you're 9 years old or 99 years old. You continuously keep on making those connections. So anything that we do, whether it's letting go of that donut or taking that walk or making sure that you go to bed earlier tonight and waking up early tomorrow morning so you can exercise, or making sure that you engage with people that are not toxic, that are empowering, that are loving, that actually challenge you, putting yourself in a situation where you learn something like that. All of these activities make these connections, and it can help us create a very, very strong and a resilient brain.
Amazing stuff. So what's on the horizon for you and Dean? What are you focused on? What are you most excited about moving forward with the research?
So many stuff. There are so many exciting things going on, both in the field of neurology and neuroscience, and also, more importantly, in the field of social sciences and a community. Dean and I both are very, very passionate about translation of information into the communities. I mean, there's amazing research that is going on, and we're all involved in that, whether it's epidemiological studies or epigenetic studies and biochemical studies. Those are all wonderful. And we're also hopeful that one day we will have a treatment for this devastating disease. But what needs to be done right now is translating all of that information into a palatable form for people to apply it into their lives. And it seems that there's a group of individuals who are very health literate, and they're very motivated, and they want to completely immerse themselves. But there's a lot of individuals who are very shy, and they're very incredulous, and they don't really have the necessary tools and the resources to apply that. And we're really passionate about that denominator, and to meet them where they are and to provide them the right kind of resources in their community so that they can become brain health ambassadors, so that they can empower their own families and community members, and for this to become almost like a tsunami of hope.
It's one person at a time, right? We just have to keep moving that information out there. We're about at the end of our time. Liana, why don't you ask the question, because we've been asking it all day long of all of our guests. So yes, go for it.
So we're asking, what's one thing that you do to keep a sense of positivity and purpose in today's challenging world?
Oh, that is interesting. It's difficult to be hopeful sometimes. I'll be very honest with you, with everything that's happening in the world. But then I look at my children. I have a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old, and how they're growing and how science is advancing. And despite all the noise, all the love that's existing, and all the wonderful people that are ready to help out, that gives me a lot of hope. Personally, I think a purpose-driven life, I know that sounds soft, but having a purpose in life makes everything fall in place, whether it's having an organized schedule, whether it's moderating your emotions, whether it's eating well and exercising and keeping up with life. I really think that having a purpose and being able to say it in one breath is very important.
Absolutely.
It has been our pleasure to have you tonight. Thank you so much. Please send our best to Dean. Hope he gets his voice back really soon, because the two of you are voices that everyone needs to hear.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.